Throughout history, people have taken on some truly bizarre, disgusting, and even dangerous jobs just to make a living. Some of these roles were downright unpleasant, while others are so strange it's hard to believe they ever existed. From human alarm clocks to literal human toilets, these are the weirdest jobs in history that don't exist today. By the way, let us know in the comments, if you had to take one of these jobs, which would you choose? Now let's look at the weird historical jobs that don't exist today. Knocker-uppers. I swear it's not what it sounds like. Do you hate the sound of your alarm first thing in the morning? Well, there used to be an alternative. Knocker-uppers were popular mainly in the Netherlands, Britain, and Ireland, beginning during the Industrial Revolution. They were essentially human alarm clocks. If that sounds weird, it actually kind of makes sense. At that time, alarm clocks were expensive and unreliable. Large numbers of people were working in factories for the first time, and they couldn't afford to be late for work. Knocker-uppers would go door to door using a baton or a heavy stick to wake people who paid them to. Some knocker-uppers were persistent and would not stop knocking until they were sure their clients were awake, while others would simply tap the window and move on to the next house. Daguerreotypist. In the mid-19th century, the first ever publicly available cameras were called daguerreotypes. These contraptions needed someone called a daguerreotypist to operate them and to create the finished product. The entire process took way longer than snapping a selfie. In those days, being photographed actually took a painfully long time. In fact, the reason people never smile in these old images isn't that they were cranky and miserable, although who could blame them if they were? It's because they had to sit still for such a long time that it was impossible to hold a smile. Imagine how much less time we would spend on Instagram nowadays if only we brought back the daguerreotypes. Plague Doctor. The image of the plague doctors we have today doesn't come from the Black Death, the plague outbreak in the 1340s that killed perhaps half the population of Europe. It comes from the 17th century when the plague broke out in Europe again. So a bunch of guys with beaked hats were sent out to treat the sick, but it actually might have been better if they hadn't. Although their job sounds noble, these men were hardly doctors as we think of them. They were often young physicians looking to jumpstart their careers or inexperienced volunteers who did more harm than good. Plague doctors were sent to areas that couldn't afford real medical care. But with their inexperience, they rarely cured patients, instead becoming record keepers of the infected and the dead. If nothing else, they've certainly inspired a lot of Halloween costumes. Leech collector. Think your summer job was bad? During the 19th century, leech collectors were in high demand because leeches were used for many medical purposes. During peak seasons, leech collectors would spend their days trudging through swamps, attracting bloodsuckers to latch onto their legs. Sometimes, they would even use old horse legs as bait. Once the leeches suckered on, they would pick them off and place them in jars for physicians to use. However, this line of work died out during the 20th century. Thank you, modern medicine. Herb strewer. The 17th century wasn't really known for being the cleanest time in history. The lack of hygiene, poor general cleanliness, and inadequate plumbing wasn't just bad for poor people. Even the super rich found themselves living in squalor. To combat this, royal families would send poor herb strewers to collect herbs such as basil and lavender and sprinkle them around palaces to mask the revolting odor of human waste. Imagine what they would have paid for Febreze back then. Breaker boys. Remember your first job? Maybe you delivered newspapers or babysat. Well, if you were a young boy in the 1800s, there's a chance you could have started out as a breaker boy. Often young children, aged between 8 and 12, these workers would break apart coal to find impurities. Despite public outcry about the long hours and dangerous working conditions, child labor laws in the 1800s weren't what they are today, and the practice didn't end until the 1920s. Lector. 1900s factory workers worked really hard with long hours and in harsh conditions. So much so that their bosses thought they deserved a break. So they hired lectors. To keep employees entertained without shutting down production, lectors would read newspapers or books aloud to factory workers during the workday. Although fun for a while, they became obsolete after radios became popular. I guess no in-person podcasts for you. Crossing sweeper. Don't want to get those new shoes dirty? You might want to hire a crossing sweeper, and will only cost you a mere pittance of a coin. In the 19th century, crossing sweepers were in charge of having the streets swept of debris for paying customers. Often done by impoverished children, they would sweep the street to protect your clothes from any muck. At the time, some people saw it as an honest day's work, while others considered it a mere step above begging, especially since wages were heavily reliant on tips. Pin setter. We take bowling for granted today. Automatic pin setting and ball retrieval makes it a fun and easy game for anyone. However, bowling alleys didn't have the technology we have today. In fact, all the pin setting and ball retrieval had to be done manually, meaning after you threw the ball, someone would one by one reset the pins and walk the ball back to you. I wonder if they would do a dance for a strike too. Lamplighter. Before electricity came on the scene, lamplighters were in charge of lighting the streets. They were responsible for manually igniting and extinguishing streetlights throughout the town. It's not as common nowadays, but some cities still use them to attract tourists. I guess that's one way to save on the electricity bill. Town criers. In the 18th century, there was no news, no TV, no YouTube. So how did people get information about what was going on in the world? Even though the printing press had been invented, not everyone could read, and the mass media we take for granted didn't really exist yet. That is where town criers came in. Men in loud coats and big black boots would walk through the town ringing a big bell with announcements to keep the people informed. Although this job has become obsolete, they still exist and continue to announce royal births today. Rat catchers. In the Victorian era, rats ran the streets until humans decided it was time to take them back. That's when rat catchers became a profession. To help eradicate rodent infestations, rat catchers scoured the streets for vermin, caught them, and eliminated them with poison. The rats didn't go down without a fight. Rat catchers were often at great risk of being bitten, making it a pretty dangerous gig in a time when an infected rat bite could cost you a limb. Human computers. That calculator you have on your phone? Yeah, that used to be a person. Human computers were computers before we had computers. These brainiacs, mostly women, were responsible for figuring out complex calculations by hand, often at great speed and under enormous pressure. They were first used in the 1700s and eventually worked in prestigious roles, such as engineering at NASA in the 1970s. Sometimes the calculations they were asked to make were so complicated that they took weeks to work out by hand. Super impressive, but also very time-consuming. Elevator operators. Nowadays, we press the buttons on an elevator and even try to shut the doors before anyone else can get on with us. However, back in the day, elevators weren't so simple. It wasn't as easy as hitting a button. Elevator operators handled levers, needed impeccable timing to reach each floor, and, in some cases, even became tour guides. Not a bad little side hustle, if you ask me. Today, elevator operators are obsolete, but you still might catch them in historic buildings. And at least then you won't be alone if the elevator gets stuck between floors. Milkman. With no refrigeration or pasteurized milk at home, delivery men became a must for people wanting to get fresh milk. In the 20th century, milkmen became the only way for people to get their daily moo juice, ensuring families had milk for their cereal and cookies. Milkmen would go door to door and leave bottles on doorsteps. This profession began to disappear with the advent of modern refrigeration, but the outfit continues to live on. Mudlarks. You know that person that walks the beach with a metal detector looking for hidden treasure? Well, that is essentially what mudlarks did. It wasn't much of a career, but more something people did out of necessity. Impoverished people in the 18th and 19th century would comb riverbanks, searching for anything valuable to sell. It was unpleasant, tiring, and mudlarks would often be covered in waste or cuts by the end of the day. I guess make sure not to lose your wedding ring by the riverbank. Ice cutters. Remember Kristoff from Frozen who sold ice? Well, that was a real job. Before modern refrigeration, we entrusted teams of ice cutters to bring the cold to us. Crews of at least 75 men would cut 1,500 tons of ice daily, which was then transported via train to the public. The job was incredibly popular during the 19th and 20th centuries, but became obsolete with refrigeration. Damn you, automatic ice machine. Phone book delivery. The phone book. For all you kids out there, the phone book was a massive directory that listed every telephone subscriber in a particular area. In other words, a huge book with everyone's phone numbers in it. No asking Siri to call mom. The concept itself might seem odd today if you're under 30, but it was incredibly popular from the 18th century up until the 90s. They were even delivered right to your door. Toad Doctor. The Toad Doctor will see you now. Believe it or not, toad doctors weren't physicians for amphibians. They were medical practitioners who used toads for treatment and were quite popular in the 17th to 19th centuries. People believed that toads would cure them of skin conditions, which often led people to tie toads around their necks. Sometimes toads would be dried, powdered, and applied to affected areas. Ah yes, because toads are known for having the smoothest, cleanest skin. Groom of the stool. Okay, this may sound like the most degrading job on earth, but it actually came with some huge perks. The groom's main duty was presenting the king with his velvet-wrapped clothes stool, or chamber pot, removing cumbersome layers of clothing, and then emptying said chamber pot. In other words, your job is to dispose of the king's poop. Although this doesn't sound like the most respectable profession, the job came with significant salaries and close contact with the king on a daily basis, literally. These grooms were essentially confidants and were highly respected, knowing the royals on a personal level. Having such intimate access to the most powerful man in the country, even if you're handling poop, made grooms of the stool the envy of the court. And hey, at least it's regular work. And there you have the weirdest historical jobs that don't exist today. Which of these jobs shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to History Snob for more weird and fascinating history facts. Thanks for watching.